Hello, everybody, and thank you, David, for having me here on B&H Optic. It's a real honor to be here, especially with everybody else who is here, and be able to share a little bit of a life in photography. So thank you very much. You know, I've been at this a while, 50 years, I suppose, and I've covered a lot of subjects. If you look back on my career, yes, it would include things when I started doing documentary photography out there in small towns in my native Kansas. 3 years that I spent photographing a high school that became a book called High School USA. Worked for National Geographic, the Colorado River, the Columbia River. I got to be Mr. Water for National Geographic there for a while. Covering the Great Plains, then which extended into covering agriculture around the world. Went up to the Svalbard seed bank when we were doing heritage seeds and breeds. Went to Peru for potatoes up in the 14,000 feet in the Andes. Lots of agriculture stories and the issues of feeding our planet. That included things like more controversial things like genetically modified foods. And one of the stories that I'm most proud of is the work I did on saving our night skies from the perils of light pollution. So yes, if you work for National Geographic, you do a lot of different kinds of stories. And I worked for them for 35 years. But I want to take you someplace else today and describe something rather different. It's about the delights of encounter, long-term encounter with a place. And I'll start off by telling you that in the early 90s, I got a phone call one day from Tom Kennedy, who is the director of photography at National Geographic. And he said, I know you would like to do a story in England. And Tom was trying to be nice to me because I had done a couple of rather thankless stories for him. And he was trying to reward me. And he said, I don't have a story in England, but I have a story in Scotland. Would you like to try that? And I said, sure, why not? Now, you have to understand, I couldn't have found Edinburgh or Glasgow on a map at the time, but I dove in. And that began 25 years of photography in Scotland, going back over and over again. Not for one story, but for a series of stories. What I want to share with you today is that whole business of ongoing encounter, of one story leading to another story, and the rich rewards that come from devotion to photographing a particular place and becoming more and more involved with it. So yes, I want to start here out there at Ben Nevis one morning near Fort William, a beautiful blue misty morning. I remember standing there and seeing this, the wonder of it, and then cursing for about an hour waiting for that one damn bird to come by. But I got it. But my real encounter with Scotland, my first thing that I started photographing was down in the borders because I'd driven up from London that first time. I knew nothing about Scotland, hardly. I'd done lots of research, of course. But I ended up down there at Selkirk at one of the borders ridings, where they ride out across the countryside, assuring that those medieval borders are still intact. Glorious scene, and I just fell in love with the place almost instantly. These long traditions, like the Braw Lads gathering there, another one of those border ridings where they ride up Scott Street yelling hurrah, and the crowd yelling hurrah back. You know, it was just a marvelous continuation of history, some 500 years old, you know. And I came from a place that was only settled 130 years ago. So it was an immersive experience in a very different kind of place. Places that still had little shops like this, a bakery where it'd be small enough and there would be a sign by the door. And the sign said, no prams in the shop, please. So mothers would leave their babies in their pram outside the shop and go inside and do their shopping, you know. And I thought, oh my gosh, how does that work, you know? But the ladies inside the shop would come up and ogle the baby. And so I didn't really think there was much danger there, but it was such a different atmosphere than I had experienced here in the United States. I started looking for all the kinds of things that I could do in Scotland. It's a country story. Country stories are difficult. because you're trying in 20 pictures or so to boil down the essence of a place. And I was trying to find that. So yes, of course, I wanted to go out to a Highland estate. I had heard about the glorious 12th, the August 12th, the beginning of grouse season. So I went out there. I finally found this place, Ballaville. And it was perfect because they had this bunch of guys who would come up there, get dressed up in Victorian hunting garb, with their muzzle loading shotguns, and go out after the grouse. So they also had a Rolls Royce, a hunting brake, one of these vehicles. They would drive them out into the countryside. So it was just laden with those great tweed outfits, all these customs, dogs, the whole thing. Of course, since they were muzzle loading shotguns, that slowed them down quite a bit and made the whole day much, much safer for the grouse. I can say that. And this guy said at lunch, he said, you know what I like about shooting? He says, you get to get dressed up. You get to get dressed up. That was the reward he was getting out of it, which was a very different dynamic than I had anticipated for. So yes, I went looking for all those places. I went out to the Niched Point Lighthouse out there, one of those lighthouses that the Stevenson family built, and which has become hugely popular in the meantime. But at that time, it was gloriously quiet in the evening as I waited for the sundown, On out to places like Lewis and Harris in the Outer Hebrides, seeing Luscantire Strand, these glorious, glorious beaches, I came from the Midwest, we didn't have any beaches. We didn't have any lighthouses, And so this was a great introduction to me, and I started really loving the place. I reasoned that if they did the summer solstice at Stonehenge, they must do it someplace in Scotland at one of their great stone circles. And sure enough, they did at Callanish Stones. And it was that sunrise was really something. Overnight, it had been a wild party. Somebody had left an eagle windsock up on one of the stones, but the rest of it was all calm and really quite sacred for all the people gathered there. So I kept gathering these bits and pieces. On Isle of Harris, I went to find Marion Campbell, who was the great heritage weaver of Harris tweeds there. And then went, of course, to Eilean Castle. Eilean, this great old castle in the Highlands. It's out on an island. It's got a bridge. It all looks the part. And I reasoned, having seen other people take pictures of this, that, well, I had to do something extra. So at the time, I got an astronomy calculator for my computer that would tell me when the full moon was going to rise. And so I was there for the rise of the full moon. I remember when I got there were 50 photographers all standing side by side, cheek by jowl with their tripods, taking the sunset. And when the sun went down, 47 of them left. There were 3 of us left. And there was myself and a German photographer and a Scottish photographer. And the Scottish photographer was folding up the tripod and going to leave. And I said, you might want to wait a minute. The moon's going to rise in 7 minutes. And he said, yeah, right, laddie. And he left. And that left the 2 of us there, waiting for the moon to rise. And it did came up. Oh, and it was glorious, yes. And then we waited another 2 hours, which is when I got that picture, and which is the one we ran in our National Geographic story. Now, I'm telling you all this as if I really knew what I was doing, but I didn't know what I was doing. This was my experience of photographing Scotland at the time. I would find one of these phone booths out in the middle of the country. I would get out my phone card. I would call my wife, Kathy, and I would tell her, I'm failing. I'm never in the right place. The pictures are bad. I'm not getting anything out of this. They're going to find out that I'm a fake. I don't know what I'm doing. And she would say, there, keep at it. You're going to get it. And it's all going to work out. She was right. And it did. And we ran it, I think, as 26 pages in National Geographic. Now, we were standing in the editor's room with editor Bill Allen, and he's looking at all these pictures and he's saying, we didn't get any of those pictures of Orkney in, did we? And I said, no, we didn't. And he was thinking, he was looking at the pictures, he was thinking, and I sidled up behind him and I said, there's a good reason to do Orkney separately. It's actually Viking, it's not Scottish. I had to give him a reason. And he said, okay, but only 3 weeks, meaning I would get another story in Orkney and I would have 3 weeks to shoot it. So I went back to Orkney, and that was the second story, beginning a path of going back to Scotland over and over again, and one story leading to another. Orkney was glorious island landscapes. Here's the Rackwick Valley, that old village there. There's Stromness, that whaling village down there that snakes along the waterfront. Flying over islands like Sanday and Chappensay and Eday and Westray, all of them with old Viking names, just wonderful. You can see how the beach is eating its way across the island there. It's going to carve off a calf, as they call them, sooner or later. And of course, you're always encountering these little things, the two sons of a fisherman standing out there on top of his boat with those raggedy old sweaters on. Or the County Boys Plowing Championship. Honest to God. The kids go out there, they have these plows, and they try and compete to plow the straightest furrows that they possibly can. So collecting all those kind of things. Finding a ceilidh on the island of Eday on a Saturday night where people came from another island and they all danced and ate and drank way until about 3 o'clock in the morning. Glorious, great fun, or just simple moments, two cats down at the quay on Chappensay, say, kissing each other, But Orkney really had the history. Stone circles like Stennis, the oldest stone circle in the UK. But the glorious thing about it was that, sheep grazed out in the middle of there. And in the evening, if you were there, you would find the ewe and her 2 lambs bedded down beside the 5,000-year-old stones. Really sweet. And totally improbable stories. This is Ronald Simonson. He's a farmer. He discovered a tomb on his property, out in his pasture one day, and he notified the authorities that they should come excavate it, and 20 years went by, and he finally got frustrated. He taught himself to be an archaeologist, and he excavated the tomb himself and became very famous as the Tomb of the Eagles. And I got in there with one of the skulls that he had kept from his Neolithic ancestors from 5,000 years ago in a little museum on his farm, and school kids can come out there and touch the skull of one of their ancestors from 5,000 years ago. I thought it was the most improbable hometowny kind of feel for the place that I had ever encountered. Yes. I kept looking for other things, island life, improbable things. So I went up to North Ronaldsay, which that's a North Ronaldsay pram. It's a kind of boat. It's a kind of boat that's peculiar to that place. Went out with Ian Deal fishing for crab and lobster out there in the boat. But why I really came to North Ronaldsay was this guy, Dr. Kevin Woodbridge, the island doctor. An island of 80 people has a doctor. Yes, well, what he's really there for is he's a bird lover, and so he runs the bird sanctuary. And he told me about this is the Fulmar Full Nelson, which is the way of holding a bird so that it won't regurgitate upon you, which I learned to my peril badly. But he was the island doctor, so he had the little office there. He would go out there 2 days a week. He would hold office hours for a couple of hours. Nobody would come. So he would also do then house calls. And he took me out to see Mary O'Netherlinay, this old woman who had needed to have her foot looked after, in this old place with a stove sitting there in the living room and all. And Mary O'Netherlinne. And what I learned about this was that there are 3 farms there. There is Linne, and then there is a farm north of there called Upper Linne, and then there is a farm north of there, and that is called Netherlinne, and that's where Mary lives, hence her name. While I was there, one of the guys who came and had tea in the afternoon said, you need to go to the old Croft house. They left so quickly, they left the family Bible. And I went over there, the roof was falling in, and there it was in the window, a family Bible left in that old Croft house. The other tradition that really caught me was a blackening. A blackening. This is where when a guy's going to get married, a couple of weeks ahead of time, his lad friends will come out and grab him and cover him in syrup and treacle and drive him around town and get him royally drunk, And it was it was great fun riding around with those guys. And then being at the wedding 2 weeks later when Alan and Karen were getting married. This was my first experience with Auld Lang Syne at a Scottish party. It's not quiet. It's not peaceful. It's a thing where everybody gathers together. They cross their arms, They come together singing Auld Lang Syne very fast, and they go apart and they come together. And that is the end of the evening. No lingering, no keeping on. Auld Lang Syne is the end of the evening. I went back to Orkney several years later with a friend, and I said, gee, maybe we'll see a blackening. And we turned the corner in Kirkwall, and there was this poor guy, plastic wrapped to a pole in a blackening there on Main Street. And his fiancée consoling him in the whole thing. She must have really loved him, I must say. A blackening in Orkney. As it went on then, I kept collecting things that I had seen and I thought would make further good stories. So I convinced National Geographic Traveler that the Edinburgh Festival and Fringe would be a good story. Of course, Edinburgh is loaded with, the castle up on the crag and all, and of course the tattoo in August, where you have 700 pipers down there on the field. But other things happened. I was walking down High Street there one day, and I heard a bagpipe inside a pub. And I thought, well, if I'm smart, I'll go in. And I went in, and there was Mary, Queen of Scots. Actually, 2 of them. Both of them from Santa Barbara, California. And they were just having a grand old time. This is the spirit of the festival and the Fringe in Edinburgh. One big party, just great. Things like the Fringe Sunday when all the performers come out there. And I found this group from Leeds and asked if I could do a portrait of them up on the hill above the Sunday gathering. Or all the buskers and the performers on High Street, for instance. This group from Leeds who was doing National No Smiling Day. And they were walking around in their brown suits and black suits and very dour with those signs, being perfectly quiet, very, very serious. And people didn't know what to make of them. And they would laugh, and then people would storm over to them and point at the signs. And it was just glorious, glorious fun. Or out at Fringe Sunday, and this guy, a punk tartan bicycle performer, caught a glimpse of me with my telephoto and gave me a little bit of extra tattoo skin. So in the history of the place, though, you see things like this. This is the great Café Royal pub in Edinburgh. And on the walls are these glorious tiles of Scottish inventors. I don't know many pubs in the world that would do that. So I kept cultivating these kind of things. Every time I was back in Washington, D.C. to the National Geographic offices, I would take the editors down the street to a bar that had 100 single malt whiskeys. And I did that for about 6 months, and the light bulb went off in their head. And they said, gee, Jim, would you go photograph whiskey country in Scotland for us? So, of course I did. This is by now, we're up to 2001. And I think it's one of the biggest and best scams I've ever pulled off for an assignment, was going off to whiskey country in Scotland. Places like this. This is Killala on the Isle of Islay. It's one of those old factory town distilleries, that's really quite so famous. This is inside the distillery, with the guy there at the pot still looking out through the big windows over at the Paps of Jura on the Isle of Jura there. So lots of the usual sorts of things doing this story, finding distilleries, finding the folks who stoke the fires to dry the grain and all, the settings, the looks of them, and all those kind of things. The incredible store of casks around Scotland, millions and millions that they age all that whiskey in. And then finding bars like this. This is the Craig Ellicky Hotel. And their distinction was that they had 900 single malt whiskeys there in the bar. They started with A for Aberlour over on the left side, and they went alphabetically across the wall there. And it became a real destination for people around the world. But I also wanted, in the whiskey thing, to not just do distilleries. I wanted to find the traditions built around that kind of thing. So I went to the Launic Highlanders, that place where they march from country house to country house, hundreds of these guys with pikes and everything, all dressed up in their kilts. And they get a wee dram of whiskey at each country house, and they do 8 or 9 of them in the morning. So, by noon, when they get to the game grounds, they're a happy bunch. They're getting to be Scottish for a day. They've had 8 or 9 drams of whiskey, and it's all pretty good. I kept looking also for more depth and more tradition. And I asked at Ballindollig Castle if they had a gamekeeper, and they said yes. And they said, "Do you have one with a son?" And they said, "Oh, we've got the one for you, laddie." I got down to the gate, and the gamekeeper showed up, and here was his son. And I swear he looked like a Scottish Opie straight out of Mayberry. And his father stuck his hand in his pocket and struck the pose of a gamekeeper. And the boy looked at his father and struck exactly the same pose. I didn't have to do anything except push the shutter. And then I had perhaps the luckiest picture I've ever taken in my life. I was down on my hands and knees looking through my telephoto zoom, my 80 to 200 at the time, at Rusty and Tufty, the 2 Highland cattle. And this guy walked into the frame with a loaf of bread, and in about 30 seconds fed Rusty and Tufty a loaf of bread. I mean, I came from a farm. I never knew cattle ate bread. So by now I'm really, I'm 4 stories into it. I'm getting to know the place, and yeah, I'm interested in finding, other places too. I figured out one day, Scotland is a Celtic country. I photographed Ireland, that's Celtic. I come from Cornwall, I've done a story there, that's Celtic. I've been into Brittany, that's Celtic. So I proposed a story on the Celtic realm. I thought I would just share some of the things that came out of that story that had to do with not the ancient Celtic realm, not a lot of archaeology, but the current Celtic realm, the living place, and the kind of things they do to celebrate that heritage. For instance, the Beltane Fire Festival there in Edinburgh, where you have 1,000 people up there on Calton Hill at midnight in the dark. The processions, the torchlit processions going around with the May Queen, And then every once in a while they're attacked by the red men and women carrying torches and they're all only dressed in red body paint, And I have often said, if you want to be a better photographer, stand in front of more interesting stuff. This kind of counts to me as interesting stuff. On the technical side, you'll notice, you see her white teeth? That's because I was using a little pop of fill flash on that. And I can tell you, when I saw that picture come through, I was mighty excited. But on out to things like the Highland Games there at Glenfinnan. I managed to survive this without getting my brain bashed in. And then to see this, though, at Glenfinnan. Every year, these guys show up to swear fealty to what they believe is the rightful heir to the Stuart crown, who lives in Austria today. They still carry that on 200 more years after the loss of the throne. So the glorious thing about it, though, was just going around all those places like Iona. There's a Celtic cross standing there. It's been there for 800 years. or to just have tea out in front of the Argyle Hotel. Such a peaceful place. That island is immensely peaceful, which is interesting because it was raided by the Vikings in 795 AD, and many monks were slaughtered down on that beach. But other places, this is Pennon. If you've ever seen the movie Local Hero, a cult movie about that from the 80s, this is that little village. This is where people were moved off of the land in the clearances and moved down to become fishermen in these little villages. I went to a Gaelic church service out there on the Isle of Lewis, and I couldn't understand a word of Gaelic, but I knew after about a half an hour of that sermon that I was going to hell. Meeting Bannatyne MacLeod, one of those crofters, those small farmers out on islands like Lewis and Harris. But as I'm going along here, I'm getting better. I'm learning to see things. I remember that pony standing next to my car window. It was raining, and the pony wouldn't get away. I kept pushing it off, saying, go stand over there so I can take a picture of you, And he stayed right there. And finally, the light bulb went off in my head, and I could see the little ringlets in its mane. And I thought, that looks a lot like a Celtic knot. And so I was picking up ways of seeing the culture expressed in the landscape, and such simple things as the wet, sopping mane of a horse. Eventually, we went on to do a story specifically on the Hebrides when we were doing many of our series of landscape stories. So this was going to be all landscapes. And the Hebrides, of course, is so rich in geology and landscape. Places like the Isle of Skye, there's the Old Man of Storr. I didn't budget any money in this story for aerial photography, so I had to find a place where you could get that sense of islands. And the Old Man of Storr is perfect. You're looking across it, down to that gigantic old landslip, down to the red Coolins and the black Coolins, and at the south end of the Skye, it's a pretty special place. Or places like, what the locals call the Hairy Loch, because of the way the grass grows in it there on the south side of the Isle of Skye, or out to Uig Strand on the Isle of Lewis. I kept going back, drawn to it, to the Isle of Lewis for a number of reasons. That bay is glorious, of course. It drains completely twice a day. Out on Lewis and Harris, I kept going past to places I'd been before too, like the Callanish Stones. And I went there one night hoping to do a sunset, and the picture was okay. And no, I had nothing special. We weren't going to run it. And I was packing up to go home, back to my hotel. And I thought, why? I can stay here all night if I like. So I did. I got out my SB800 flash for my Nikon. I had an SU800 so I could fire it remotely. And I started playing with that, lighting up just one stone and letting all the background go dark, And then about 2 o'clock in the morning, I got out my little flashlight, a little LED flashlight about 5 inches long. But it was enough light that I could start painting the stones there. So I paint the stone on the left and the stone on the right, and then hop inside, hide behind a stone and light up the center stone. I kept doing that. About 2:30 in the morning, this guy comes down and he says, oh, who's running around in the middle of the stones with a flashlight in the middle of the night? So I explained all that. And then I asked him, could I take your picture? And he said, well, sure. So he stood there, held still for 30 seconds while I painted all the stones. His dog almost held still for me, So I kept at it. By about 3 in the morning, Venus has risen, and I'm getting better at all this. I'm lighting the stones on left and right. I hide behind one of those stones to light up the center stone. Then I run through the frame and hide behind the center stone and light up the stones in the background. And then in the next one, I turned around and lit up the grass for the final 5 seconds of it. None of this I had ever thought of when I started the evening. I'm just kind of inventing things as I go along. And then I stepped out, and about 4 in the morning, the blue was coming into the sky. I still had enough darkness to light the stones this way. And that really ended up being the picture that we ran as a centerpiece picture of our story from the Hebrides. With that kind of technique in mind, I went back to Iona, and I got the guys who run the boat there, the Isle Air, to take me on their daily run out to the Isle of Staffa, where Fingal's Cave is, and leave me there overnight. Now, I asked a couple of guys to go along with me. One of them was the pastry chef from the Argyle Hotel there in Iona. And we camped overnight because I wanted to get Fingal's Cave. Well, while I was waiting, I was doing pictures like this of those great basaltic outcrops, But even as I'm photographing this, I know that that's not going to be the picture. It's going to have to be the interior Fingal's Cave. The problem with Fingal's Cave is, well, it's black and it's basalt and it's dark. And everybody who goes there takes this picture. It's not a bad picture, but we're not going to run that. I had to do more. And finally, I figured out I should light the inside of it. So we tried in the evening there with my flash units, trying to light it, and we just weren't getting the power that we needed. So about 3:30 in the morning, way before it starts to get light, we went inside, and the two guys helping me are in the back of the cave there with 2 million candle power flashlights, and they are lighting up the interior. Now, so at this time, it's way too much flashlight and not enough cave. Along somewhere around 4, I think it was, we started getting this. You get more blue light coming in from the outside, and I could tone down the flashlight by telling them only do it for 20 seconds out of a 5-minute exposure. And so they would do that, and I would direct them, and they would do that. About 4:30, I believe it was, we got that. Now the blue is really making the basalt column stand out. There's light coming from the background, and that ended up being another one of the centerpiece pictures of our story. And I went back out to St. Kilda, that island that the islanders abandoned in 1930. They dwindled to 27 people. They couldn't go on. I'd been there several times before, sometimes with National Geographic expeditions, and been able to do a picture like this, looking down on that island. Those abandoned houses, the abandoned fields, the abandoned pastures where they had their sheep and all. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's really glorious. But when I got out there for this time, I had a week there, and it rained the whole time. It rained constantly, blowing 40-mile-an-hour wind the whole time. And so I spent a whole lot of time out at like 2 a.m. out there doing long time exposures, trying to get some kind of mood out of the thing. What always lured me, though, was being up there on the island, was looking out and seeing the island of Borray. Can you see it over there on the right? Borray is an abandoned island with all these birds. I had never seen it at sunrise or sunset because, well, everybody goes out there doing day trips. So I hired a boat, and they took me out there. We got there, and it was totally socked in. And I thought, oh, this is $2,500 wasted. And we went around the island, and a little bit of sunlight started coming out, and the birds, tens of thousands of gannets, started flocking out at us in the boat. I was bobbing in the sea, about to go over the edge. The crewman is holding onto my belt so I don't go over. And then I zoomed in, and I got that picture. Now, I always thought when I was there in the moment that it was the previous picture, but it turned out this is the one. This is the one everyone always latches onto. Those gannets coming out of that primordial looking island there that really set the stage of it, the real prize of doing that story. So now you're going to see, of course, that I'm on a roll, and I'm scheming every which way that I can to go back to Scotland for more stories. Sometimes it's a couple of years before I really get back for shooting. But the editor of Traveler asked me what I would like to do. I appreciated that. And I said, I didn't get to finish the Hebrides. We pulled the plug halfway through, and I'd like to go back and finish the inner Hebrides. And so they gave me a chance to go back and photograph for my obsession with the Scottish Islands. So I went out to someplace like Eigg. I'm on the Isle of Eigg. I'm at Leg Bay, and it has this glorious beach. Black basalt sand washing over white shell sand in these rivulets, nobody who goes there ever does a bad picture. I was there on a really blowing rainy day, and it helped. I pulled out my half gray filter, of course, to darken down the skies, because it was so dramatic the way the clouds swirled around the Isle of Rum over there, that black island. What I was really here for, though, was to see the Isle of Muck. And it's only 39 people, but it just has this great name. And it has this guy, Lawrence McEwen, who is the Laird of Muck. What a great title. You know, he's a medieval laird, and he owns this island. His family has it. It's just great. And he has these eagle eyes. So yeah, I wanted to see him. I went across the island on the only road. It's a mile long and a 2-lane asphalt affair. And I found Lawrence herding his sheep along on his bicycle. You know, he's just basically a farmer who owns an island. And it was really cool. Went down onto the beach there with his horses. That's Rum in the background back there. Rum gets those clouds really reliably. And now that I've told you, you know, I'm going to be pulling out my half gray filter again to darken down the sky and really make them pop out. So I went up on top of his island, and this is just a lesson in how dumb I am. I went up there twice. I wanted to see the whole scene, of course, but I went up there twice. And finally, the light bulb went off, and I said, you know, I have to have Lawrence up here. So we went down, asked Lawrence, begged him if he would come up, and of course, he was glad to do it. He came up there, but it's blowing about 40 miles an hour. I can't think of what to do. It's a panic moment as a photographer. I'm trying vertical frames and horizontal frames, and then he leaned over against the walls there, up an old fence on the top of the mountain. And his dog started to come over, and Lawrence reached up to pet the dog, and then he petted the dog, and then he turned that eagle eye to me. And there it all was. I was shooting through my 16 millimeter, I think it was a 16 to 35 Nikkor, 16 millimeter, getting it all in, you know, and it's just, everything's there, and he's got the eye. And then I keep shooting because miraculously, in the next moment, the next frame, this happens. A little puff of wind caught his hair on the side of his head. He opened his eye a little bit. He gave me the eagle eye, you know. It was just everything. The previous picture was fine. This was sort of over the top. Glorious moment. I kept going around those small islands, you know. I went over to Rum, which has this abandoned castle on it, Kinloch Castle, you know, and went inside, and there is this, in this abandoned castle, is all of this stuff, a Steinway and Japanese panels and tiger rugs and all the stuff sitting in this abandoned castle. To get it all in, I ended up doing a panorama of this. This is a stitch, I think, of about 5 frames going across there that I stitched together because I really wanted to have that sense of being in the middle of it. Went out to Inverie. Inverie is this most remote little village on the mainland, really. And I took the car ferry out. And this is the car ferry. You back your car onto that car ferry. Yeah, it's quite exciting, you know. But there's no road in or out of this place. Take the car ferry. But I got really lucky. That night, the Noidart All-Star Ukulele Band was practicing in the pub, the Old Forge pub, one of the most famous pubs in all the islands. And we sat up there for almost till midnight, singing Jolene and all kinds of weird songs. And it was great, great fun. I went out to the Isle of Jura, and I asked a friend there if they had any gamekeepers out there. You kind of see me repeating myself. And she sent me to Gordon Muir, which was perfect because he really looked the part out there, the telescope, the whole thing, you know. Shot that with my, I think it was a 35-14 Nikkor that I shot it at about f1, f2, so that I could keep the background out of focus and really bring it in onto him. Now, if you go up to the north end of Jura, you'll come to Ardlussa Estate. And It's one of those hunting estates. If you went on north, you would come to a gate. You would go through that gate. Further north is an old house where an author came in 1947 to write a book. And he finished it a year later. That year, 1948, he transposed the last two numbers and he published the book as 1984. This is where George Orwell wrote 1984. And one of the darkest visions of human life. I didn't go up there. I turned the other way. I went down to Inverlassa at the end of the road. And there I found this table and this sign, Tea on the Beach. And if you'll look closely, you'll see in that little plastic box is a walkie-talkie. And if you go over to the walkie-talkie and pick it up and say, hello, Georgina Kitching will answer from her kitchen. And she'll say, would you like some tea and cakes? And if you're not an idiot, you'll say yes. And she'll bring them down to you. And you have your tea on the beach on an island of 200 people at the end of a one-lane road, 17 miles from the nearest ferry. It's glorious. Well, by now, National Geographic is sending me story proposals that they've gotten, and they'd gotten a proposal for review. And they sent me a proposal about Neolithic Orkney. And of course, I wanted to go back to do that. It was all this 5,000-year-old archaeology. We're there. I've got my assistant with me. I'm shooting that at the Stones of Stennis, the same place I shot the lambs and the ewe. I've got my 24 millimeter perspective control Nikkor on there, you see, so that I can keep the stones very straight. I don't want them falling over as I look up at them. And my assistant on this foggy night said, well, how about if I go over with my flashlight and stand behind the stones and light it all up? And that really was the magic of doing the picture. At the time, we also tried doing some aerial photography. We tried doing kite photography, and my advice about kite photography is, oh, don't do it. It's a terrible idea. But we got this picture. This is before we could have done drones there. Of the Ring of Brodgar, and you could really see the setting of it and looking down on it. The thing about Orkney is it had all these houses and all this archaeology. You could see daily life. This is the oldest farmhouse in Northern Europe. This is the Nap of Hour up on Papa Westray. And then there's this Skara Brae, that wonderful old Stone Age village there on the mainland of Orkney. We had 4 of us there that night lighting this with flashlights. So there's a person lighting up that dresser there in the middle, and then on each side we're there with flashlights and lighting up the hearth in the middle and the beds on the sides and all the little nooks and crannies and that kind of thing. And we did it 2 nights in order to really make it work. But the same technique there, back to the Tomb of the Eagles, borrowed the skull, got the eagle skulls that Ronald Simonson had found there, got them all arranged inside the tomb. That's all a 30-second exposure, me with one flashlight lighting up the whole scene as I work through the darkness. And then on to places like Maze Howe, that really great tomb. Did some aerial photography of it, of course, but the glorious part of it is inside. And this was a really tough place to shoot. What you're seeing there is about an 8-picture panorama. I've got strobe units, Nikon SB800s inside each of those chambers on the side, and I'm adjusting their output depending on if I'm lighting that section of the picture or another section of the picture. So I would shoot the left-hand side with the flash, and then use my flashlight to light up certain highlights in it. Pan over and do another section, pan over and do another section, and then stitch the whole thing together. What you're seeing there is about 200-degree angle of view, I think. It's really quite a lot of the interior of the tomb, and nobody had done anything like that. But the real glory of this place is if you drive home out there on Orkney, drive past the Watchstone in the evening, you're going to go by a farmhouse up there, and in the backyard of the farmhouse was this, a 5,000-year-old Neolithic temple site. Lots of big buildings, just amazing stuff. I was shooting this from putting the camera up on a pole and using a remote to fire the camera looking down. This is the main archaeologist, Nick Card, who I really became good friends with on a rainy day when they had to call off digging. But I knew what I had to do is I had to do a scene in which I got the sense of it, that there were buildings there. But the rubble of the dig is such that you can't often see it. So once again, we've got 4 of us with flashlights. I've got my camera up on top of a pole about 30 feet in the air with guy wires holding it steady so that we could do a 5-minute exposure. And then 4 of us lighting up various aspects of the whole scene during that exposure. And then you just had the moment, this young woman who found a stone axe head that had been buried there purposely 5,000 years ago, or the little artifacts. That's a little clay figure. It's only 1 3/4 inches high, you know, and I was using that little tiny LED flashlight to light it up and bring out the features of the face and things like this. Some of the closures that they use to hold their clothes, and lighting that with flashlights so I could just highlight each one of those separately. Or they would bury skulls around the foundation of their house. This is one of the skulls that the archaeologist found. And then back to places like Stones of Stennis. I kept going back there, waiting for the full moon to rise over it, lighting it again. This is the way we really ended up lighting it, you know, for what ended up being the cover of National Geographic under our story called The First Stonehenge, because that is 700 years older than Stonehenge. Yeah, it's really quite marvelous. Finally, in Orkney, one time I was back there, and we had done this picture of Jimmy Tulloch and his sheep grazing. And I asked Jimmy, so how do you get the right to graze your sheep amongst the stones? And he says, oh, I own them. I said, how's that work, Jimmy? And he says, they were on the farm when I bought it. The final story I wanted to show you was of the Scottish moors. You know, if you're going to do the Scottish moors, you have to do heather. And we looked all over. We spent 7 days looking across Scotland to find the right heather. Finally went back to Mar Lodge. The next morning, we had glorious heather. We had glorious sunlight. I actually had my assistant, Paul, just outside the frame with a flashlight, lighting up that blue heather there in the foreground to give it a little more there. But a lot of it was just about the seeing of the place, seeing those hills in the Cairngorms, the patterns of the hills, the glorious quality of it, or getting really lucky and being in the Cairngorms and have this misty rain come across like a veiled curtain across the landscape and giving that sense of mystery and all. Going back over and over to Loch Marie, went to that island 4 times. And finally, on the final morning, we got this gloriously calm morning, which was part of our story, because the reason those trees can grow out there is because deer can't get out there and nibble off the little buds. That was part of the ecology of the story. It was the deer populations, you know. It gave me an excuse, though, to keep poking further and further into the islands, go out the wee mad road out there on the northwest coast of Scotland, climb up atop Sgor Tuath, that really dramatic landscape. It looks like the American Southwest. When I saw that in a picture, I knew I wanted to go there just for that sense of vastness, you know, and realize that when I'm standing there, I'm standing atop the 2,944th highest mountain in Scotland. There's a lot of Scotland to explore. Deer were a big part of this story, so I went to see Colin Murdoch to see his deer. They farm deer in Scotland quite a bit. They breed them, they take care of them and whatnot. So that was a nice picture of the deer. It looked like the monarch of the glens, but this is the picture we used. And that deer in the lower left-hand corner looking at me there, like Bambi, I could kiss that deer. He really made the picture. Going back to those estates for the hunting season, the stalking, I knew this had to be part of our story. Went back to Ardvariki. You've seen it in several movies and television series. It's just perfect because it looks the part. They use ponies. Everybody gets dressed up. all of that. But that's the picture we ended up using out there, the stag that they've just shot. And I wanted a really classic look for this. So I ended up shooting this with a, my Nikon D800E with a 50-1.4 Sigma. I shot it at f1.4. That's a panorama of about 7 frames. So I would just ask them to hold still for a minute while they were standing there like that. And then I panned across and stitched it all together. So I got that very shallow depth of field, but also got the vast effect of it. And I went back to the Launic Highlanders, those guys marching across the countryside amongst the tree farms and all. In 1997, I had been there, and we stopped on that march underneath a tree, and the guys got out their flask, and they had a wee nip of whiskey. 2017, I went back. We stopped underneath the same tree, the same guys, the same flask, the same whiskey. And they remembered me. And all of a sudden, I felt like, I'm becoming part of this place. I'm becoming part of its heritage as well. Well, yes, they are a happy bunch when they get to the grounds. I want to leave you with this. I want to leave you with this moment out there on the Isle of Lewis at Baltos, where I had been asking around if I could find an islander who was going to haul his sheep out to the island for summer grazing. They sent me to Johnny Buchanan, and I got down to the quay, and there he was loading sheep into this 150-year-old boat. And I want you to watch it particularly because I noticed that lamb on the front thwart there, and he made a break for it. And then he was in the drink, and Johnny had his mouth gaping open. I loved his gesture there. I can tell you that no lamb was harmed in the filming of this sequence. They fished him out. But it always represented to me that serendipity of richness and reward that came because I was there, because I had been involved with this place for so long. This has never been published. I only share it with people, and when I do this personally. I love the connection. I love the richness of the place. I love what photography has done for me, allowing me to go back to this place for 25 years and discover more and more. So if you're going to Scotland, if you're going to do some photography there, I think I could give you a couple of tips. Certainly don't miss Edinburgh. I mean, the castle, the Princess Street Gardens, all of it, especially if you're there during the tattoo and the Fringe in August, all right? Then you probably want to head into the Highlands, go up, maybe go on the whiskey route there through Speyside or something like this. Certainly maybe go through the Cairngorms, those glorious mountains, and find a Highland Games. I would do that. There are some websites that will tell you when they are happening, and there are a lot of them. They are more like the county fairs of Scotland than they are one single event. So you can find them in many, many places. I would do that. Almost everybody then goes on out to places like the Isle of Skye because, well, they have a bridge, and that's the easiest one to get to, and it's glorious, but it gets a bit busy. So I often advise that people consider, go out to the small isles, places like Muck, Egg, and Rum. You can do that. You can go out to Islay, which has 8 or 9 distilleries on it. It's the real whiskey island, and on to Jura that I always love. You can go on out to the outer Hebrides like Lewis and Harris, really much less population, dramatic landscapes, lots to explore. Or then go off to Orkney. Orkney is a very different place. It has very much a Scandinavian Viking feel to it. 20 islands of about 22,000 people. So it's not that busy, but it's glorious with its own sort of character and lots of things to see. And then, of course, as you sweep back down, maybe you go down to the borders for a different taste of Scotland than most people gravitate towards. So Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about Scotland and to be part of this great event. Thank you.